Hello, science lovers. Welcome to tonight's Teen Science Cafe. We appreciate you joining us. Remember to be respectful to guests in the chat as our moderators will be keeping an eye out for any inappropriate comments. Also, check us out, Teen Science Cafe Raleigh, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Tonight, we've got an exciting guest for you. Dr. Casey Busch is a science education professor at NC State University. She moved to North Carolina a few years ago and has lived in Iowa, Texas, California, and Africa. She was a high school teacher for several years and enjoys working with students our age. She has a special fondness for birds, the moon, and word puns. Please welcome Dr. Busch.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the warm welcome, pun intended. I'm really happy to be here tonight talking to you about climate change and the research that I've done about climate change in teens. So I will switch over to my screen. And we'll play. You can all see everything hopefully okay. Just have to get the 3,000 Zoom windows in their proper places. So, so tonight I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about climate change, and then also a little bit about why you think the things that you do about climate change. This is based a little bit on my research, but then it's also based on other people's research. Throughout the presentation, I'll be asking you lots of questions and you can answer in the chat box to let me know what you're thinking about those things. So it's meant to be a little bit more interactive. So just a little bit about my background. Thank you for the introduction, Leah. So I was born and raised in a little town in Iowa on the Mississippi River. It's a town of about 30,000 people, very blue collar. I didn't grow up on a farm or anything like that, although my family did own a farm back in the day. I was the first in my family to go to college. And so I went to a small college first called Buena Vista University. It's like 1,000 students in Northwestern Iowa. And that was mainly just because I was unsure about going to a big school. I thought I might get lost in the shuffle. After 2 years there, I switched over to Iowa State University, which is very similar to NC State University. It's a land grant university centering science, technology, engineering, math, agricultural sciences too. So my degree was in ecology, which is the study of the environment and all of the relationships between like the physical environment and animals in the environment. And I was particularly interested how people fit into that environment. So, years later, here I am, and I'm really still studying the same thing. That was my interest from the very beginning. After I got done with my degree at Iowa State, I decided to go into the Peace Corps, and that is the picture that you see in the top right-hand corner. I look very young there. So in the 1990s, I went and lived in Africa, in Ivory Coast, Africa, which is a small sub-Saharan country. It's next door to Ghana. People usually know where Ghana is because of soccer. But Ivory Coast was a great experience. So it was me living in a town of about 55,000 people without sewer, without trash collection. Most people did not have running water or electricity. So essentially it was a really big overgrown village. And my job there was to work with communities to develop action plans to clean up their neighborhoods and meet needs that they had set for themselves. So it's hard to see in that picture. It's kind of dark, but there's a little piglet down in that walled in area. And so, there was livestock everywhere. So there's a lot of human health issues that are related to these environmental conditions. When I was in Africa, what I figured out is I was doing education and I thought it was pretty slick. I really liked that you could make change from the bottom up. And so when I came back to the United States, I decided to become a teacher. And so in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a picture of me with a bunch of students out on a field trip. So I was a teacher in Austin, Texas for 12 years. I taught middle school for 3 years and then high school for 9 years. And mainly the classes that I taught were environmental sciences and earth sciences. So you're seeing the common thread here through all of my work. After 12 years of teaching, I decided to go back to school, and I went to University of Texas in Austin. That's a hook 'em horn symbol, which is very similar to the NC State wolf pack, and got my master's degree in science education. And I started studying how people understand climate change. I was having such a good time that I decided to go on for my PhD. So if anything, I'm very overeducated here. Went on to my PhD, went to Stanford University out in California. And when you get your PhD, they give you a super fancy Harry Potter outfit. And so that's what those robes are. After that, got the position here at NC State and moved to Raleigh with my family. And so that's my family. I have a son who goes to Enloe High School, and he's a junior there. He went there because he's interested in computer science, and Enloe has a great computer science program. I have, that's my fur baby in the bottom corner. She's a Wheaten Terrier and full of zest. One of the cool things that I've gotten to do is go work in Galapagos, which is where Darwin sailed and came up with some of the initial pieces of his theory of evolution. And I've been to Galapagos 5 times now to work with teachers who live on the islands. And that is a blue-footed booby in the picture there. His feet don't look very blue because he is juvenile. But he was really interested in me, and I think it was because of the patterning in my shirt. So he came right up to me and like hung out with me for quite a long time. And then down in the bottom right-hand corner, that was a trip that we took last summer, pre-COVID. One of my bucket list places to go, which was Greece. And so that's Athens, Greece there with my family, and it was amazing. So that's just a little bit about me. In the chat box, if you would like to introduce yourself, your first name, what school you go to, and then in particular, why are you here tonight? Like, what are you interested in knowing? What sorts of things do you want to know about climate change and so forth? I'll give some time for that to happen. Go Eagles. We actually live right down the street from Enloe too, as well. Cool. Well, as you're typing in, I'll tell you, my first teaching job, which I'm not going to tell you what year that was in, but I was teaching 8th grade and I was teaching climate change to my students. And I remember drawing like on the chalkboard and going through like how climate change is happening, and kind of expected my students to be like up in arms when they got done learning about climate change and wanting to do something. I will just let you know that it was crickets. So, right. So part of the research that I do is understanding what and how people come to understand climate change, and in particular, how teens do. So the other thing I'd like you to put into the chat then is, if I say climate change, what is kind of the first thought or image that comes to mind when someone says climate change? So I've done this research with students and with teachers, and I will let you know that when I ask this question of youth, um, kids emphasize current negative effects of human-caused climate change on people and animals. So when I ask kids this question, they say, they give me pictures from day after tomorrow. They talk about polar bears being isolated or starving. So they have these really evocative images of how climate change is affecting people and animals. And yet, when I listen to teachers talking about climate change, teachers tend to focus on future negative effects. So they're not necessarily talking about what is happening now, but they pitch everything as to what's going to happen in 10 or 20 years. And they talk about the effects of climate change on physical Earth systems. So they'll talk about temperature changes, or they'll talk about sea level changes. And what I noticed there then is a mismatch, right? Because if you think about what might be motivating, one of these is probably more motivating than the other. And we're going to dig into that here. So quick response in the chat box. If you just like to tell me, how sure are you that climate change is caused by humans? Are you extremely sure? Are you very sure? Are you somewhat sure? Are you not at all sure? So I pulled this data. This is a really great resource if you want to understand how people think about climate change. Yale Program on Climate Change, which is also partnered with George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication, and they do survey after survey after survey of folks in the United States. And about half of Americans think global warming is mostly human caused. That's changed over time. But in general, it kind of hangs around that just over half. The other half think that it's a cause of a mixture of natural changes in the environment and perhaps a mixture of human activities. So that's what people think. I will let you know that when they've conducted that study with teens, that teens actually score higher on that. More teenagers think that climate change is caused by humans than do American adults. So how sure do you think scientists are that climate change is caused by human? Are scientists extremely sure, very sure, somewhat sure, or not at all sure? So this is what Americans think about scientists thinking about climate change. And so again, a little over half say that most scientists think global warming is happening. And about 25% thinks that there might be disagreement among scientists. The closer answer is about 98% of scientists, especially climate scientists, talk about climate change being caused by people. So there's this big difference between what scientists are saying and what Americans are understanding about climate change. And so it's this gap that I'm interested in exploring further. Another question, how confident are you that you could take actions to decrease climate change? Are you extremely confident? Are you very confident? Are you somewhat confident? Are you not at all confident? So most Americans think that there's still time to do something about climate change. In addition, they think that it's not too late, but that it is pretty impending, like it's something that we need to act on quickly. Last question for right now is, how important is climate change among your family and friends? Would you say that it's extremely important, very important, somewhat important, or not at all important? Again, same research source is that most Americans don't really talk about climate change with their family and friends. Probably not surprising, right? I talk about it in my household, but it maybe just doesn't come up with, it's not a hot topic, haha, pun intended, right? It's not a hot topic for people to be talking about. So this is not surprising to me that most people don't really discuss this topic with their friends or family. But there is probably an understanding of whether or not your family and friends think that it's happening, or whether or not your family and friends actually take action to decrease climate change. Fewer than half of Americans, though, do perceive social norms for taking action on climate change. It's a little bit less than half on importance to family and friends. So we have clearly a lot of work to do in better understanding how people understand climate change and choose to take action. So where do I stand on climate change? Again, I told you people, I like word puns. So where do I stand on climate change? I'm going to give you just a quick kind of climate change 101. I'm not talking a lot about the science here, but if you have more questions at the end, you definitely can ask me. I'm happy to talk about that. This is, let's see, I have too many things open. This is a picture of how temperature has changed over the entire Earth from about 1880 to present, and it's a little video that I will play for you. Blues are cooler than average temperatures, and reds and yellows are warmer than average temperatures. And as you see, temperature changes really at about 1950 onward. And the simulation ends at 2018. The last decade has been the hottest decade in recent history. So temperatures are really, really quite high. This is, you might notice, I have this as a background on several slides. This is a visual of how temperature has changed over time as well. Very similar to the last thing that I showed you. It's just static and you can see it over time. On the left-hand side is 1950, or 1850 rather, and on the right-hand side is 2017. And it's the same thing. Blues are temperatures that are less than average, and reds are temperatures that are higher than average. And you can really see how the last decade has been hotter than average overall. 2020, so just last year, was the second hottest year on record. But climate change is more than just temperature changes. And so here you see a bunch of what are called indicators of climate change. So we see temperature, that's A, that's in the top left-hand corner, but you see these other things as well, like heat waves and sea level and sea ice and ocean acidity, seasons for growing, precipitation, and snowpack. The one that I'm going to talk about is wildfires. So you might remember that last year, and I was supposed to give this talk actually last January, not canceled because of the pandemic, ironically enough. It was actually canceled because of a big storm that we had and power went out. And so this was super timely then, but it's still timely because it is just the last fire season. So it's the last bit of full data that we have. So about this time last year, Australia was completely on fire. There were so many different fires. It was in the news every day, and I'm going to pull up the notes on that. About 46 million acres of Australia burned, and they called it Black Summer because the fire season was just so ferocious. There was lots of images that came out of Australia of people that were chased out of their homes. They had to flee their homes. About 80% of Australians were affected either directly or indirectly because of these fires. The fires in Australia damaged about just a little under 6,000 buildings, and 34 people directly lost their life. In addition, about 3 billion vertebrates or animals were affected by climate change. They showed lots of images of koalas. Right, koalas are not quick creatures, and so they aren't able to get away from the fires. About 8,000 koalas were lost in the fires. And one of the things that scientists are most concerned about is that these species are really vulnerable to extinction. And so to lose that many koalas is really, really worrisome. And it's not just the fires directly, but once the fires burned through, it took out a lot of food sources. So this is a wallaby, the smaller cousin of the kangaroo. And they had to do food drops for a lot of animals so that they had a food source. So what explains this just really crazy fire season? So again, temperatures. This is specific to Australia, but it's the same that we've seen globally, which is that over the course of the last 100 years, it's becoming hotter and hotter. And with that, there was a very serious drought. So those conditions together of serious drought and really high temperatures essentially just made Australia very vulnerable to fire. You might not care about Australia, and that's totally legitimate. We had the same thing happen in California. So in California, it was I'm going to look up to make sure I'm not lying to you. They had 9,000 individual fires over the course of the burn season in California. About 4 million acres were burnt. That was about 4% of California overall burned. It was the largest wildfire season in history. So it's not just Australia, it's the United States too. Despite, right, this indicator that is in your face, right? So the reason I choose fire is because it's super visible. So it might be that sea extent or things like that, or things that you can't see, but wildfire is something that is very, very visible. Despite that, in the United States, there's quite a few people who don't believe in climate change. And one of those folks is our soon-to-be ex-president, Donald J. Trump. So year after year, this is 2012, he talks about how cold weather in New York and around the country, in the northern part of our country, is kind of evidence that climate change is not happening. And that goes right up to 2019. He continues on. This is a piece of artwork that is in Europe, and it's called Politicians Arguing About Climate Change. And so when the tides come in, it winds up flooding them. So the idea is, right, that we're going to argue at the same time that we're completely inundated with the effects of climate change. Despite all of that, we have some really heartening news. And that heartening news to me is the 2019 Time Person of the Year was Greta Thunberg. And right, she acted as a lightning rod, I would say, for climate activism, especially among teens and youth. It was pretty amazing to see all of the climate marches that youth were organizing and holding over 2019 and 2020. And that's really what a lot of my research is about. I want to figure out what inspires people to take climate change related actions. So another quick question here. So I showed you a bunch of images as I was talking about climate change. The top row of images were from Australia. It shows animals and people. And the bottom row of images are data that I presented to you. The question that I have for you is, which set of images made you feel more concerned about climate change? Was it the top row of images of animals and people, or was it the bottom row of images of data? Oh, excellent icebreaker. Thank you, Caroline. Word puns are always appreciated. There is no such thing as a bad word pun. So which set of these images made you feel more concerned about climate change? Is it the set of images on the top of animals and people, or is it the set of images on the bottom? Now remember, right, these sets of images, when youth describe climate change, they usually describe it in terms of the top set of images, and when teachers usually talk about climate change, it's in the bottom set of images. So what I found from my research that I do over and over again is usually it's the top set of images that make people feel more concerned for climate change. And even within that top set of images, if you look at the images of the kangaroo and the koala versus the image of the kid and the presumably someone that she knows, her parent or a guardian, if I ask kids which one of those is more cause for concern, the images of animals or the images of people, would kids invariably say that the images of animals cause them more concern than the images of people. When I ask adults that same question, it's actually reversed. Adults, when they see effects on humans, it causes them more concern than animals. So why might that be? And this is where we get into kind of the psychology of it all. So scientists say that your brain runs on two systems, and they call them, oddly enough, system 1 and system 2. System 1 is what they call fast thinking, and system 2 is what they call slow thinking. There's a really great book called Thinking Fast and Slow that I would recommend if kind of pop psychology is your thing. But it's not just kind of a theory. They have done a ton of research to kind of look at this two system way of knowing and thinking about things. So let's apply this idea. System 1, or fast thinking, is unconscious, right? You don't really think about it. It just ideas that come to mind. It's very automatic. And the system 1 helps us with everyday decisions, right? If you had to think about every single little thing that you did, you would just be mired in thought. The bad thing about it is it can be really error prone. System 2, on the other hand, the slow thinking, it's very conscious. It takes a lot of effort, and it's really good at helping you make complex decisions and analyzing data. It's very reliable if you can queue up system 2. Thing is that we operate a lot of our day on system 1 and only queue up system 2 when needed. So let's apply this to climate change. System 1 is inspired by emotion and narrative and kind of these evocative images that I showed you of the koala and the kangaroo. System 2, the slow thinking, deliberate, effortful system, is what is cued by data, right? You really have to dig into it to make sense of it. So what do you think might inspire climate change action? Do you think that more knowledge would lead to more climate change action? Do you think more certainty, like whether or not we think climate change is happening or whether or not we think climate change is human caused, might lead to climate change action? Or do you think social norms might lead more to climate action? Social norms are the things that we think the people around us do and think. Like, what do your family and friends think about climate change and whether or not they take any action? Or is it this thing called efficacy? Efficacy is a super fancy word that we use in educational research to talk about whether or not you think your actions could actually have an impact. It's one of those questions that I asked you at the beginning of this presentation, whether or not you thought your actions might actually have an effect. So efficacy is this idea of whether or not if you did something, it would actually curb climate change. So of those, which one do you think influences climate change action the most? Is it more knowledge? Is it more certainty? Is it more about social norms and what we think people around us think? Or is it more about whether or not we think our actions would actually have an effect? The fancy word called efficacy. I'm pausing for the delay in chat. Okay, so I've done this research with youth, and yep, social norms is winning. It's yeah, well, you're right. I've done this research with youth, and what we find is that people with more social norms about taking action around climate change are more likely to take climate change action. The second most important is efficacy. So it's so social norms is like, what should you do? And efficacy is like, could you do it? So if you feel like your actions are actually going to have an impact, you're more likely to take climate change action. Certainty about whether climate change is happening or whether it's human caused is the third most important. And knowledge about climate change is the least important. And this is really important, I think, because one of the common refrains that I hear is that, oh, if people knew more about climate change, then they would be more inspired to take action. But my research with teenagers and research done with adults shows that to be wrong over and over and over again. So how does this relate to system 1 and system 2 thinking? So remember, system 1 is fast thinking. It's not very conscious. It's not something that you sit there and really grapple with. It's kind of this like gut feeling, right? So social norms and efficacy, I would say, are more system 1 or that fast type of thinking. Whereas system 2 would be more about knowledge and certainty, which I come back to. So when we think of social norms, one of the things that we see in the United States is that someone's political affiliation, whether or not they're a Democrat or a Republican, a liberal or a conservative, is very connected with whether or not they think that humans have caused climate change. So this is like an idea of social norms, right? So if you say, I'm a liberal Democrat, then you're probably going to take on the same ideals as other liberal Democrats and agree with those social norms that say that human activity is causing climate change. Whereas if you're a conservative or a Republican, then you're much less likely to think that. So it could be about politics and your political affinity. But what I found, and I don't know if this is true for you as well, teenagers in general don't have a very strong political identity yet. And so what I found in my research is that teens, instead of taking on this, like adults do, this kind of political affinity to decide whether or not climate change is happening, they take their cues from important people to them that they're around every day. So family members, peers, both in and out of school, and even their teachers. And this is especially true, I think, when we look at the youth climate action movement. Social movements in general like this are really spurred on by these social norms. What should we do and how can we do it? That's really what these social movements are all about. On the other hand, knowledge and certainty is that system 2 thinking. That's the slow thinking, effortful, deliberate, but like really slow, and you really got to put a lot of energy into it. Knowledge and certainty. But there's problems with this. So one of the places that you might learn about climate change is in school. And I've done a bunch of research. This one's not mine, but some other that I'll present to you is, in general, schools are not very good places to learn about climate change. So this is research that talks about, or that looked at how teachers talk about climate change. And a little over half of teachers do present the scientific consensus that climate change is happening. But the others present mixed messages. So they talk about maybe climate change happening or not happening, or being human caused or natural. Some actually present that climate change is not happening, or they might just avoid talking about it altogether. This is research that has been done with teachers. In my research, I found that teachers only talk about kind of the scientific facts, and they don't talk about how it's going to actually affect you. This is just a funny, the onion. I love this one in the middle, right? It's so hard for teachers to know what's right, what with the overwhelming abundance of scientists all saying exact same thing, right? So there's this idea that climate change is perhaps not being presented in a way that is accurate. And it's not just teachers. I've done a bunch of research with textbooks as well. And so this was an actual textbook from my son's 6th grade classroom in California. And they talked about the climate variation hypothesis. And they said, not all scientists agree about the causes of global warming. Some scientists think that it could be caused by natural variations in climate. So here is a printed textbook that's being given to students that is just flatly wrong. So in the chat box, what questions do you still have about climate change? And I know there's a Q&A, but I just wanted to give you a few seconds or so to give me additional questions about climate change. So the big takeaway then, and this is what I encourage you all to think about, is kind of feeding your head, right? And when you feed your head about climate change, you have to consider both system 1 and system 2. So remember, system 1 is that fast thinking. So I encourage you to talk to your friends and family about climate change. I encourage you to engage in climate art. There's a whole group of fiction about climate change, but then there's also a bunch of art, movies, art installations that are about climate. To also seek out youth climate change action groups, that is going to help with the social norms aspect and the efficacy as well, because once you engage in those actions, you're likely to feel like your actions are going to be meaningful. And I always encourage people to make small changes. Small changes are so much easier to do, right? New Year's resolutions, right? What is it, January 15th? And right, how many of us really kept our New Year's resolutions? It's usually because they're just too big. We need to make small changes that add up over a period of time so that we feel like we're actually making a difference. System 2, which is that slow thinking, I encourage you to seek trusted sources of information about climate change. Globalchange.gov is a really great resource that I encourage you to go check out. Don't encourage you to use Twitter or Facebook or any other social media sites. There's a lot of misinformation on social media about climate change. And because of that, I encourage you to be critical of the information that you encounter in that social media source. Think about sources that they're drawing from and possible biases that might exist. And so I just want to make time to answer any questions that you have. This is some street art that I saw is Venice Beach in California. And I just really liked it, so I kept it. So any questions?
All right, Dr. Busch. So we have one quick question. How long do you believe it will take to begin seeing significant changes if serious action were to be taken?
Great question. So the bummer is that one of the causes of climate change is increases in greenhouse gases. So these are gases that exist in our atmosphere anyway. They're there, they're good, they do good things. But when you get more of them, then we start to see unbalance. And some of the gases are short-lived. And so I'm not particularly worried about that. Carbon dioxide, which if you've usually people when I talk about climate change, they know carbon dioxide. They link carbon dioxide to climate change right away. So carbon dioxide is created when you burn essentially old dinosaurs, when you burn fossil fuels, right? Carbon dioxide lives in our atmosphere for roughly 100 years. So if we literally stopped producing any carbon dioxide, like right this very second, we will see the effects of climate change due to carbon dioxide for the next 100 years. That's why all of these treaties have been begging for us to decrease carbon dioxide like now, before effects are getting too bad, because they know that carbon dioxide lives so long in our atmosphere. So that's like one part of the answer. I think another solution that we'll have to really investigate is something called carbon sequestration. Super fancy word. It's trapping carbon. So how can we take carbon out of the atmosphere? One quick and dirty way to do that is trees, right? Trees take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they bind it up in leaves and tree trunks and all of the plant parts. So that's one quick way to do it. But the folks who do like geoengineering are also looking at fancier ways of doing that, where they're actually drawing it out of the atmosphere and trapping it underground in essentially like big caves. So they're almost like vacuuming it out of the atmosphere and then trapping it so that we can take some of that carbon dioxide out. So it's not a very happy answer. We have a lot of work to do, and that's why scientists have been kind of sounding the alarm for so long. But I'm optimistic that we'll be able to make those changes.
Yeah. All right, next up, we have a question from Divya H. What do you think is the first step the US government should take to help slow down climate change right now?
Right. So it's kind of an exciting time, right? Because we've just gone from one administration who more or less ignored that climate change was even happening and took us out of the Paris Agreement, which is a kind of a worldwide agreement to decrease carbon dioxide and other emissions to decrease climate change. So the administration coming in, that was one of their main, Biden's platform was climate change. I mean, it was one of the top 3 things that he talked about, which is really refreshing. So what do I think it's going to take? I think it's going to take all kinds of stuff. I don't think we're going to be successful if we keep asking people to like drive less or take shorter showers or turn off lights, unfortunately. That kind of individual action only goes so far. So what I think we have to do is we have to take like a bunch of different approaches, like a portfolio of approaches, like 25 to 30 different approaches, and apply them all at once and have them apply at different levels. So yes, buy a Prius, right? Like drive less, don't eat meat, use electricity less, things like that. But then also, one of the things that Biden is talking about is a green economy. So like, how do we like literally switch over from fossil fuels to more sustainable resources? And there's some real engineering pieces that we can be applying, like those geoengineering solutions. And then, even kind of like at the highest level, industrial pollutions and things like that. If we have really strong regulations, then we can decrease industries that produce a ton of greenhouse gases, producing the things that we buy from them. So I think we have to take like this multifaceted approach where instead of just doing one thing or 2 things or 3 things, like we do 100 things all at the same time.
All right. Moving on to a rather pessimistic question, but from
Oh,
Naveen Prabhu, do you think climate change will be the biggest fault in our generation when looked back upon?
like the faults, like of, so I think it, uh, I'll just say that the people who made the mess aren't going to be the ones who are cleaning up the mess. And that goes for age, right? So, right, it's really as a function of, just increased industrialization in the last 100 years, but in particularly, we've really seen it right in the last 50 to 70 years. So that generation, right, grandmoms and grandpas, although you guys are really little or young rather, so great grandmas and great grandpas, right, those are the folks who've made it. Whereas I think it's going to be one of the greatest challenges of your lifetimes. I don't think there's any part of your life that climate change won't eventually touch, because it affects you at all levels. And that's why I'm always hopeful, and that's why I liked working with teens, and that's why my research is about teens and youth, is because I hold, and this is like in pushback to your pessimism, but like I hope that your generation is able to make this mess better.
All right. Next, we've got a question from Olivia. She
Mhm.
asks, where do you see the future of climate change research going, and how can we develop more science?
Cool. Yeah. So I definitely, right, I study the psychology part of it, like why we think what we do about it. And I think that there is a lot of research that we can still do to understand how people think about this topic, so that we can help them understand it and take action better. So I still think there's a lot to be done there. But in like the sciences, I really see a great need for kind of the engineering pieces, to be honest, right? So, right, one of the big things that keeps us from moving towards like solar and wind being used even more broadly is batteries. So, I mean, it comes down to such a minor thing, but really good batteries that can store a charge for a very long period of time. Right, those are some of the cutting edge pieces of science that you think that they aren't like connected to climate change, but they're very much connected to the solutions of climate change. So I see a lot of room for kind of engineering solutions that can help.
All right. How does your work address or can possibly address climate equity, such as
Mm,
contributors versus those affected? And that comes from Anne.
That's a really great question. And that's kind of what I alluded to earlier, is that, right, we have this disparity in age, in that the people who made the mess are not the people who are cleaning it up, right? So the older folks have made the mess, and now teens and youth are going to have to be the ones who are cleaning it up. But then that also goes for who's made the mess globally and who's being affected the worst. So, right, this really, these are industrialized nations. So that would be the Northern Hemisphere, right? So it's North America and Europe, who've produced the most greenhouse gases. That's changing over time with China and India, but that's still, right, predominantly industrialized nations. And it's the unindustrialized nations and the nations that are less developed that are paying the higher price, because they don't have the capacity to right to have some of the adaptations that we have, even so far as where they live. Like most people live along the coasts, and fish is their primary food source. Well, with climate change, we have flooding coasts, and we have heated waters disrupting fish. So unfortunately, there is a great injustice in the causes and the effects. Um, what I found, and I don't have research that deals with it specifically, but I know that other people who do work in this, and they have found that this justice kind of framing um, of why we need to take action is really powerful for youth, and that it's a big driver, right? Because it's a matter of fairness, and that kind of speaks to some kind of deep-seated value that people have.
All right. Question from Aaron. What are some common difficulties that you face in your field?
Mm. That's a great question. Okay, I don't know where you want me to go with this, but I have stories. So I have been attacked for some of the work that I've done. So there are climate denialists who have featured me on their like blogs and their websites for the research that I do. I've had people send me these huge documents of like all of the reasons why climate change is not happening, and like they're missives. They're crazy. They're wild, right? So I've had people tell me, that I need to, learn more about climate change to become more informed, right? So I get I do not a lot of pushback, right? But I have gotten pushback on, climate change isn't real. Like, why are you studying this? I haven't gotten there aren't too many other difficulties. It has been difficult in the last 4 years to get funding to do climate change education research, because a lot of funding sources are through the government, and that's been an area of difficulty. So because climate change has, in the United States anyway, is very connected to politics, there's a lot of debate, and we're seeing that, right, even with coronavirus and vaccines, and we're seeing the same thing over again. I think they're very similar types of problems. It's just that coronavirus is affecting everybody right now, whereas climate change is not affecting everybody, and it's kind of like spread out over time, but the same problems are seen throughout. So yeah, not too bad though. I'm not gonna whine. I got to do my work. It's a pretty good gig.
All right, so next I'm going to combine two questions. I think they're fairly similar, from Aaron and Lynn. So if I'm concerned about a climate change, but my family is not, how can I start a productive conversation in my house? And also, have you ever used your research to change the mind of a family member?
Oh, my gravy. Yeah. So I told you all I was from Iowa. I was more conservative, just kind of a place to live. And I have lots of family members who would fight with me on Facebook about climate change not being real. And so usually the path of communication that I took was to try to meet people where we might have common values, right? So maybe they don't want to save like the polar bears. Okay. Like maybe increasing temperatures is not motivating for them. But I did think, a common value is that we would rather leave our children with a better situation, if at all possible, than what we currently are setting up for them, right? So that's a value that I hold, and that would be a value that my family would hold. And so trying to communicate areas where we have commonalities, and that usually can center around values, can be really powerful. So my research doesn't address kids talking with their folks, but I do have someone at NC State, Catherine Stevenson, who does this research, and they have found that youth can be really influential in helping their parents to understand more about climate change and to be more concerned and take action. And so I encourage you to have that conversation. I think it has to be right, different than the conversations that we have on social media. It has to be really respectful. It has to be as much listening as there is talking. and asking why people think the things that they do, and trying to understand where other people are coming from, so that then we can like move towards the middle and find that common ground. So, I mean, that's my recommendation. I think there was an organization that was it was called Have the Conversation, which kind of sounds like sex ed, right? Have the conversation, like the sex talk, but it was about having a climate change conversation with your folks. And it was called Have the Conversation. I don't know if you Google that, what happens. I don't know what you might come up with, but I do remember that being like a big thing. So they might have also other types of ideas, but I don't think data necessarily is going to be the thing that's motivating. I think it's going to be those values and what we want for the future, that those are going to be the things that are more motivating for those types of discussions.
All right, and now say for a high school student or even maybe middle school students, if they're interested in pursuing the field of psychology and climate change, what would you recommend they do to better prepare themselves for a career or a job in your field?
Well, I'm in education, so it's just a little different. But so, right, my field, I was camp counselor, right? So for education, I took kids out in Iowa. This is a part that I didn't talk about, but I did a bunch of environmental education stuff before I went off to Africa, and even while I was in college, right? So we would take kids out into marshes and like trudge them through the mud. And so there's a lot of great opportunities for you to do engagement with younger kids through the museum. The museum has some great programs, marbles, and some environmental education centers. So trying to get that experience is really great. So far as like, if you wanted to go into engineering or things like that, try to see what the universities are offering for summer camps. Because what I've noticed is that a lot of universities, especially like their engineering departments, they have these summer camps that are a little bit more advanced, right? They're really trying to get that content in there. And so take advantage of those opportunities if you can, to get that kind of experience. I think it'd be really mind-opening. But otherwise too, like, give yourself a little bit of a break, right? It took me, right? It's a winding path. It's not a straight arrow. So don't worry about it if you don't got this all figured out.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Busch, for your time
Thanks
and
so much.
knowledge. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time for any more questions. And thank you to all in the audience who asked any questions. And I do apologize if we missed any. We tried to cover all that we get. And now I'll hand it over to Christine for closing.
Thank you again, Dr. Busch, and thank you all for coming. We would also like to thank the digital media staff for assisting with this presentation. Don't forget to follow Teen Science Cafe Raleigh on Twitter, Facebook, and tag us on Instagram. Also, keep an eye out for a follow-up email containing a survey, or go to tinyurl.com/teenscisurvey2. Once you complete the survey, you will receive a discount code for the museum's gift shop. For any rising 9th through 12th graders, the museum will be opening applications for cafe coordinator positions, so be on the lookout for those in the next few weeks. We will also host virtual positions next school year, so you don't have to live close to the museum to participate.
Be sure to mark your calendars for February 5th, when Vernon Turner, a meteorologist with Spectrum News, shares how meteorology can be used to inform environmental management strategies. And with that, this month's Teen Science Cafe has come to an end. Thanks for joining today's cafe. Be sure to like the video, burn the subscribe button, and combust that bell icon button to make sure you never miss more premium content from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. Like Christine said, we are soon opening up applications for the cafe coordinator positions for the next school year. So stay tuned to our social media to get the latest updates. On a different note, MLK Day is coming up. I know that I'm going to help out my community, and you guys should join me, either by donating to a code drive or some other place. Wear a mask and stay safe. We have gotten the ball rolling in 2021. Let's hope that this year is going to be a good one. My name is Shashank, and these have been your cafe coordinators. Thank you, and peace.